Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Defender podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goosen, and I'm joined as always by my friend from the Netherlands, Koos.
Hey Chris, how you doing? I really like the pronunciation. Really worked on that one. You can really hear it.
Hey man, thank you. I've been practicing, just walking around the street, just saying Goossens a lot. So it's people think I'm crazy, but what can you do?
Nice.
Good to see you, my friend. Good to see you. Excited about
Likewise.
Another episode. Today's episode, we're going to cover a couple of things. So I'm going to just dive in and continue, I guess, as a part two with looking at the email security stuff that we started in our last episode. So specifically the sequel. And it was really funny is in the show notes, so Koos writes the show notes or writes a lot of the show notes ahead of time. And he had written this section out. And one of the things he had written was sequels aren't always better, but this might be an exception. Well, I'm not sure about that. I cracked up when I saw that. But what we're going to do is I'm going to dive a little into sort of SPF cleanup and large SPF records, things like that. We'll briefly look at authenticated receive chain or ARC, and then also I'll sort of break open what MTA STS is, or mail transfer agent strict transport security, and sort of give a bit of an overview of what that is. And then Koos, you have some SIEM topics, do you, today?
Yeah, it's already, I think, quite an accomplishment that I went through 3 episodes earlier without talking about Sentinel that much, because people who follow me and know me a bit know that this is a topic I'm very passionate about. I worked on it a lot. But I had some great discussions the last couple of weeks about also the talk I will be giving again in March, and it's a popular topic. So I was like, maybe I can do a short version of it in the podcast. So yeah. So
Very cool.
Talking about Sentinel, log ingestion, probably SIEM migrations. I see companies struggling with that a lot, and I have some thoughts on that. So like to share. Yeah.
Hey, that should be interesting. I think we're the whole SIM concept, I think, is starting to become more mature for a lot of organizations. So I'm excited to kind of to hear that one.
And new regulations are also forcing them to store logs more often and for longer periods of time. So yeah.
Yeah, very nice. So I guess jumping right in, let's look at SPF. And I think if you recall from last episode, we talked about how SPF is sort of really, really important for making sure that servers sending email from your domain are actually authorized to do so. But one of the things that we talked about as well was that, the DNS lookups that happen during an SPF sort of exchange is limited. And I was talking about 10 being the sort of recommended, and Koos, I think you actually even asked, like, what is the actual strict limit? Turns out the strict limit is 10, right? So, yeah, that's right. So ultimately, your SPF record does have a limit of 10 DNS lookups, right? So anything that is an include, an A, an MX, a PTR, if you mechanism in the record, those count towards the 10. Obviously, anything that is an IP4 or IPv6 doesn't, right? But there's another limit that I actually hadn't considered, and I think when you sort of dig into what a lot of these SPF flattening tools do, you might come up against this, which is the actual limit of a text record in DNS. I did not know that text records in DNS actually have a limit of around 512 bytes. So
it makes sense, right? Otherwise, people would be storing files in there.
Well, that's right. It and I've never really tested the upper limit of a text record in DNS, but you may run into that if you start running flattening, and you end up with all these lists. And I'll get to why in just a second. But I think one of the other things we were talking about is, well, what happens if we have too many DNS records, right? Or DNS lookups in the record? Well, actually, according to the RFC spec, you will receive a permanent error, SPF permanent error. And if you have DMARC and those types of things configured, DMARC will actually reject that because it sees a permanent error as a failure and it was meant to reject it. So you'll definitely end up with some mail delivery issues if you have a very large SPF. So what tends to happen here then is folks go, well, I have all these includes that need to be added to my SPF. I've gone over 10. How do I fix this? Well, you do a quick search on the interwebs and you find that there are all these websites online that will flatten your SPF record for you, right? And you enter your domain name, and what the service really does is it takes all of the IP blocks within the include and sticks them into one big list. So you end up with a flat filed list of a bunch of different IP addresses, right? So now you don't need to do DNS lookups anymore because you've got all these IPs that are just listed there. But of course, if you have a lot of them, you could run into this issue of large records, right? Large DNS text records. The other thing that I think, and personally, and I'll say this, is I'm not a big fan of this. I'm not a big fan of this. I think that it can be a little bit of a lazy answer here. So generally, my recommendation to customers is don't flatten your records unless you absolutely have to, right? 10 lookups is quite a lot, especially if you have includes. And these days, with the fact that we have so many less on-premises infrastructure, those MX and PTR and all of A record sort of includes that we do on those records are starting to go away anyway. So you end up with these cloud native records that don't have a lot of that on-prem stuff anymore. So that saves you. And again, it's why it's really important to just keep, auditing and cleaning these records as often as you can to keep them optimized, right? So I would say be very, very careful of these flattening services. They just chunk everything into a big block of IPs. Now, yes, it solves the problem, but it probably creates a bunch of other problems that you weren't thinking about, right? So for one, the administrative burden of now managing these great big chunks of IP blocks, right, in a record. Secondly, IP addresses change, right? Microsoft is constantly changing the addresses that it uses for outbound mail flow, adding new ones, changing things. I'm sure any email provider likely changes their addresses, and that's why we use DNS to begin with, right? Because we can hide all of these things behind a DNS namespace, and we don't have to worry about what the underlying IPs are. Now, if you start flattening these things, you're going to end up in a place where you have to manually manage all of these IP ranges and manually sort of check them, right? So I would say be very, very careful with using these services. There are some services around that sort of advertise a dynamic SPF where they will do the flattening and managing the records for you. Obviously, you pay for that service. They manage it for you and make sure that your record is constantly updated and maintained. I've never personally used a record like that. I don't know I've never worked with a customer that's used a record like that before. So your mileage may vary on those. I'd be very interested if anyone's listening to this and has some solid, stories to tell, either good or bad experiences about this. Please reach out to us. I think it'll be very interesting to understand and to know. I would, be careful with those services. It obviously takes away some of the burden of this, but if you're going to pay someone to manage something to do with your email, I would say invest that money into a DMARC reporting service instead of someone to manage your SPF, because you can manage your SPFs yourself if you just spend a little time to clean it up and keep it nice and lean. It doesn't have to be rocket science. And the flattening services do exactly what they say. They flatten those records into just a big blob, right? So.
Yeah, so Chris, in the show notes, you also had a funny remark. I actually had to Google this one. You mentioned that you had to be cautious with the flattening, and you put a quote in there, and it didn't ring a bell with me. I had to Google it. So,
Danger, Will Robinson.
Yes, apparently that's a meme I completely missed.
I taught you something. That's interesting. Yeah, no, just be careful, right? I think is what I wanted to call out on that one. So,
but are you old enough to have watched Lost in Space?
Not when it originally came out, because I think it came out in the 60s or something, right?
Yeah,
so,
something like that, right?
No, I'm not quite that old. We get referred to as dinosaurs sometimes, but not quite that much of a dinosaur.
Yeah, I'm accused of a lot of boomer humor already as well. Right?
That's right.
True. Yeah, sorry for that, but I thought it was funny.
Yeah. So, hey, folks, we actually do spend time putting effort into the show notes, right? So everything we talk about here, it's a good point that Koos brings up there is we really want the show notes to be almost standalone blog posts on their own. So even if you don't listen to the episode, and of course, we'd be very sad if you don't listen to the episode, but if you don't have time to listen to the episode and you really just want to see what's going on, the show notes really are pretty comprehensive to break down what we're talking about and actually provide, links to additional things, right? I think that's the other key part here is that we can't always cover an entire topic in its entirety on the show, but we can link to Microsoft documentation or other MVP documentation, blog posts, things like that. So show notes are worth looking at for sure.
Yeah.
So with that, I wanted to just briefly cover Arc. And again, those folks who are using M365, you may or may not have heard of something called Arc or Authenticated Receive Chain. Microsoft M365 already supports this. There's not a ton that you actually have to do here as far as this, but really what this does is it helps preserve those authentication results, right? So when you send an email and you have SPF and DKIM and DMARC, all of those things that we talked about in the first episode, first part of this email discussion. Well, when those emails get authenticated and they then get forwarded on or go through some intermediary service, right? So think about a forwarding service or a mailing list service, something like that. All of those mechanisms are essentially trashed, right? And so you run the danger of those emails actually being declined or deleted or rejected on the other end, because even though they were legitimately sent to begin with, the service that was in the middle has done something to change them, and it's kind of messed up those authentication results. Well, what Arc does, Arc actually helps prevent this from happening. So it actually preserves that information, and it stamps it the email with some additional headers called, like, there's three of them. There's the Arc authentication result, which actually has those records in it. There's an Arc seal, and then there's a message signature. And a lot of services will actually start looking for those. We'll look at those Arc headers now, and we'll actually honor the original authentication. So if you sent an email, it's gone through an intermediary that has forwarded it on. As long as your original email message to that intermediary passed SPF, DKIM, DMARC, all of that, those results will be honored at the very endpoint, provided that the endpoint looks at those things, right? So it's actually really interesting. Again, there's not a ton you actually have to do here. If you are having some issues with mail delivery from intermediaries, some things are coming into your environment, they're not coming in right, or they're ending up in junk, you can actually go and have a look. And if you see that there are Arc headers in those messages, you can actually go and add that intermediaries, what they call it, Arc seal. You can do that in the Defender portal. So if you're actually having inbound problems with email that are coming through forwarding services, that would be a way for you to kind of resolve that. I put some information in the show notes to the Microsoft Docs article, kind of talks about all this stuff and breaks it down. Just thought it'd be interesting. It's not a significant thing, but it's one of those things where you hear it mentioned all the time and you don't quite know what it is. So nice to be able to say, I actually know what that does now, and you may or may not need to use it from your side. One that I think is really important, and I really think that this is, in my mind, becoming sort of the standard for secure email, is something called MTA STS, and it's Mail Transfer Agent Strict Transport Security. Massive mouthful. We'll just call it MTA STS from now on, right? MTA STS is relatively new, but one of the reasons why I like it, because I feel like the adoption of this is actually happening, right? And we've seen with a lot of other things over the years is someone tries to solve problems within SMTP, but the adoption just isn't there, and eventually it just dies out, or it becomes a project that no one even knows about, right? And the nice thing about MTA STS is it solves some problems for us, and specifically it solves encryption, right? So originally, obviously, SMTP was unencrypted, and even today, most servers, the initial connection between two SMTP servers is unencrypted until such time where the start TLS command is actually offered and accepted from both sides, right? But it's only an offer and an accept. A mail server doesn't have to accept start TLS, and in many instances, the internet's full of old stuff, so the mail server may not actually understand what start TLS means, in which case the sending server will just revert back to sending that whole email exchange as plain text. So you can think about how that could be sort of bypassed or maliciously used to try and either get in the middle of an email transaction or spoof a domain and actually receive email and then back or downgrade that the request by not accepting the start TLS and receiving email in plain text. So it's really got to do with the encryption of your email in transit. And what MTA STS does is it actually helps solve this problem, because it allows a domain owner to create a policy and specify that you want to strictly enforce TLS on your connections, right? So that gives you as a domain owner a little bit of an extra, tool to say, when I send email, I want my email to always be encrypted. Obviously, you can't always guarantee that the receiving end is going to accept that, but it gives you that initial or original tool to be able to do that. We implement this in a couple of ways, right? And so far, we've talked a lot about DNS text records, DMARC, SPF, all of these things are text records. You won't be surprised, MTA STS is also a text record. But what the text record does is it actually refers to a policy.txt file that is hosted on a web server. And the policy file actually tells the receiving server what that policy is. So really good documentation about this is already sort of available everywhere on what your policy should look like. The one that I really like is there's a Dutch MVP called Michel de Roy. Michel's written a really great blog post about how you can do this and how you do this hosting your policy file on GitHub pages, which is really nice because that way you don't have to pay for hosting your policy.txt file. So STS MTA-sts.txt is the policy file. So I've included some links or a link here to Michel's blog. If you don't know who Michel de Roy is, he's another one of those great Dutch MVPs, and he's really is one of the sort of the original OGs when it comes to email and email security and pretty much anything email. So I would strongly recommend that you follow him and check out his stuff. A great post here for getting started with MTA STS. You've probably heard, and you may have heard also of something called DANE, which also people talk about, which is DNS-based authentication and named entities. DANE is kind of similar, but again, one of the problems with DANE was and is it requires DNSSEC, and not every provider on the internet supports DNSSEC. And so because of that, a lot of folks haven't implemented DANE because of the DNSSEC reliance, and you're wanting to fix one small part of your infrastructure, but it means making a massive change to, moving to a different DNS provider, for example, right? It's not ideal. And so because of that, DANE adoption just hasn't been very, very good. Well, STS is very similar, but the great thing about it is it's much easier to deploy, specifically for email. And it works with standard DNS because you're just creating a text record. You don't have to have DNSSEC enabled and going. So I'm a big fan of this. I really think that I really hope this is going to sort of take off a lot more, and the adoption on this is going to continue to grow. It is fully supported in Exchange Online. So, not a ton other than creating some policies that you need to do there if you want to use it. And I have also linked to the Microsoft documentation in the show notes if you're interested. So lots of great reference links there for you to go and check out.
Well, this was definitely Empire Strikes Back, Chris. So good job. So I wanted to switch over to a completely different topic, Microsoft Sentinel. Are you familiar with the product, Chris?
I am. I've dabbled in Sentinel.
You've dabbled. Well, I actually looked it up, and it's already Sentinel already celebrated its 5th anniversary last September, which is crazy to me because I started my job at my current employer around the same time. But a lot of stuff has changed as well. So Sentinel, for those who might not know, is Microsoft's cloud-native SIEM solution, and a SIEM obviously stands for Security Information and Events Management. So it's always been typically your solution to store your system events, your logs in for security purposes. And I think Microsoft did a really a different approach. So 5 years ago when it came out, it also doubled as a role as a security orchestrator, I mentioned back then, because all the different Microsoft security products had their own portals 5 years ago. And with Sentinel, you could tie in all those defenders. Well, they were not all called Defender. Azure Threat Protection, and what were all the names? A lot of renames ago. all the things tied into Sentinel, and you had one single pane of glass, one list of all the events through Sentinel. And it obviously evolved a lot since then. Sentinel has now also made part of the new unified security operations platform, which is security.microsoft.com, where all the other security products nowadays live, finally. But I've seen the role change as well for Sentinel a bit. So since all the data is already in the security portal, there might not be a need to send all the same data back to Sentinel again to have it again in that same portal, right? But I do think it's really valuable to connect through Sentinel your custom logs, or perhaps your sign-in logs, or maybe you have another business application like SAP or Dynamics CRM or something like that, which you want to tie in through Sentinel with all the other security products. But Microsoft had a bit of a challenge with their pricing model. So with it, well, I would say quote unquote traditional SIEM solution, you pay probably a lot of money up front for a license and maybe some hardware, or you store it in the cloud. But then it doesn't really matter that much how much data you store in there, right? You have a big bucket and you can gather as much as you like, and you can figure out later what's useful and what's not. With Sentinel, you pay an amount per gigabyte you ingest in that. So there lies a big difference and a responsibility to make sure you are very aware of what you're storing and the usefulness of it, because especially with large quantities of logs, it will cost you at the end of the month dearly, especially with network logs, for example. I have a lot of discussions with customers about that. I see you nodding, Chris. It sounds familiar.
It's very, very noisy, right? And I think historically, there's always been the tendency when it comes to logging, the answer is, give me everything, right? Yes. When you talk to a customer, what do you want to log? Everything. I want to keep everything forever. But of course, with Sentinel, as you mentioned, right, that can get very, very costly very, very quickly. So it becomes almost very, very important to think about how do we make sure we get only the really important stuff that we need without all of the junk.
Yeah, and it's clear that Microsoft is really working on that as well the last couple of years. So they came out with new logging tiers, table tiers. So now you can change the tier of your table to basic or even auxiliary. Auxiliary is the latest edition. It's still in preview right now, but it gives you a much lower price per gigabyte to store the data in. It also comes with quite a lot of limitations for obvious reasons, because Microsoft is probably not storing it in their high performant SSD storage in the back, because, well, for cost reasons, of course. But at least it gives you different ways to handle those logs. But during SIEM migrations, I ended up with a lot of discussions about why are we even keeping those logs? And like you said, Chris, companies just tend to want to keep them all, and you really have to figure out what's useful and what not. And I would even say, and it might not be the most popular opinion, but if you're already in the Microsoft ecosystem from a security perspective, and for example, you are also onboarding Defender for Servers or Defender for Endpoint, for example, on your servers, you might not have an additional need any longer to also ingest all the raw Windows events and Linux syslog events from those same machines, because those logs are already stored in the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint platform. They're analyzed there, and Microsoft is already extracting alerts and alarms and incidents from that. And I would reckon that you can probably not do a better job than Microsoft by looking at the same logs and creating your own detections. But that's how we did it, right, in the past. And I would reckon that if you have Defender for Endpoint, you might want to reconsider storing all those raw logs as well. For example, Defender for Identity, for example. So Defender for Identity runs a sensor on your domain controllers, your on-premises domain controllers, or they might be running in the cloud, but your legacy Active Directory, right? And I would say that there might not be an initial need if you already have Defender for Identity running, and Microsoft is making sense of all the signals in there, to also ingest the Microsoft Windows security events into Sentinel as well, unless you have a very particular use case. And if that's the case, that's fine. But then you only want to ingest those particular event IDs, for example, to cover your detection, instead of grabbing it all and storing it all.
Mm. It's a very good. It's a very good point. I once played with Splunk, right? Like ages ago, before Sentinel was really a thing.
Hmm.
And I got the Splunk at the time. You could get like a free, I think it was 1 gig or something,
Mm-hmm.
cloud service just to kind of play around with. And I decided to take and I think it was like all my lab servers and my firewall. And within an hour, it was full.
Yeah, and that's also something I really like to make customers aware of. For example, if they have a fancy shiny Palo Alto or FortiGate firewall, a lot of those products come with their own intelligence as well. They probably have integrated threat intelligence feeds. They have deep packet inspection. They have all kinds of fancy signatures to detect malicious behavior inside SSL packets, for example. Why not leverage that knowledge that you already have in your firewall and ingest only the intelligence feeds, the alerts, the alarms from those platforms into Sentinel, instead of going forward with ingesting all the raw traffic logs? Because I would say, if looking all those raw traffic logs, they're just source, destination, port, protocol, allow, you know them. They're not going to help you prevent any ransomware by looking at them.
Yeah, interesting.
And there are clever ways to ingest only the alarms, for example, which keeps the cost very low, because there won't be thousands or hundreds of thousands a day of those, and then the logs will be very minimal. And I think that would be a better approach. So with SIEM migrations, I always go through the list with the customer. What kind of log categories were you storing in your SIEM? And category per category, we decide, okay, what's still useful, or are we going to keep it? Are we going to filter it, or are we going to drop it, or perhaps store it somewhere else? Because that's always an option. And that's actually what my talk is about. I'm doing currently at events. I really became a fan of Azure Data Explorer, so I wanted to mention that product here as well. And I think Azure Data Explorer can be a great companion alongside Sentinel, because it offers a very flexible and extremely cost-effective way to store large quantities of data. And it even it still provides the KQL, the Kusto query language querying on your logs, similar to Defender and what Sentinel is using. Actually, KQL, did you know that, Chris, actually originated from Azure Data Explorer?
I did not know that. No,
No,
that's very
no, it's
interesting.
the name Cousteau query language. The name Cousteau actually came from that French diver Jacques Cousteau. I'm not sure if you know that name from all the documentaries on television years ago. So Microsoft thought it was a nice link to Cousteau, because you're diving in a sea of data with KQL. So that's a little bit of a backstory there. Yeah, so Azure Data Explorer is where KQL, the Kusto query language, originated from, and then it branched off into Azure Monitor, Log Analytics, Sentinel, Defender, etc. And I probably even Fabric or some other data platforms are using it as well. It's very powerful to search through large quantities of data, and I think that's the main reason why I'm also a big fan of Azure Data Explorer. And I helped multiple customers now deploying Azure Data Explorer alongside Sentinel to still have them to give them the option to store all those raw network logs and all kinds of raw logs for compliance purposes, perhaps even forensics reasons. If they have a breach, at least they have the data there, right? And they can sift through them. But the costs are actually a fraction of the price. And what's funny is that Microsoft recently announced the auxiliary logs, which again is in preview right now, and that has exactly the same price as Azure Data Explorer if you would ingest 100 gigs a day. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think they're really targeting customers who are moving away from Sentinel, perhaps into Azure Data Explorer, to keep them at Sentinel. And I think they're doing a good job with that. It still has some cons over Azure Data Explorer, I think, and if customers are ingesting terabytes a day, Azure Data Explorer price even comes down further. So I think it's still interesting to at least consider. And what most people also don't know is from the Defender portal, you can actually search your Azure Data Explorer databases. So there's an ADX function in KQL where you can link to a certain database in ADX, and your security analysts, when they're doing their incident response and their triage, they can also branch out to ADX and look for let's say, a certain IP address if your firewall had seen that IP address earlier, for example, stuff like that. So I think it's really powerful. But with great power comes great responsibility. Somebody once said. Azure Data Explorer is an Azure resource. You have to deploy it. It is a PaaS service, so you don't have to really spin up virtual machines. Microsoft does that for you, but it's still a resource you have to manage. So you have to monitor some metrics, make sure that ADX will not run out of memory or CPU or whatever, and that might be the biggest downside as well. So it's an additional stuff to keep an eye on.
Yeah. It does sound like it could be a really valuable tool though, using the two together. And I was going to ask you, so I think for a lot of organizations, when they think of Sentinel or just SIEM in general, they think, wow, this is complicated stuff. Are you seeing that that's changing, or more smaller businesses adopting some things like Sentinel these days? Or do you think they're just using a lot of what's natively available in the Defender portal now?
Yeah, well, the answer is a bit twofold. I was asked once during a talk how many users a company should consider Sentinel, and my answer back then was 1. Because I think a lot of stuff is already useful from the get-go. So, for example, your Azure activity logs, for example, you're familiar with them if you browse through Azure. Every resource group has the activity log. They're your audit trail, right, in the Azure platform. You can ingest those logs into Sentinel for free of charge. You're not charged for them unless you store them longer than 90 days. You pay a little bit for retention. That's fine, but the costs are really low. And again, for first 90 days, it's actually free. There's already a huge benefit solely for that purpose alone. You can have all kinds of detections in Sentinel, detecting perhaps malicious behavior. If you're enforcing infrastructure as code deployments on certain subscriptions, for example, you can monitor interactive changes by admins or users, which you want to be alarmed of and you don't want to see there. So I think even smaller companies can really benefit from it. That said, I also see a lot of companies focusing on SIEM from the purpose alone, without them considering moving to Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud Apps, all the other stuff. And there I might say the priorities might not be correct. Companies focusing on, we really need to have all these network logs because of reasons or because we always did it this way. And at the same time, they're also running Server 2003, XP, unpatched machines, RDP to the outside world, etc., etc. I'm like, okay, maybe you should go fix those large holes in your security first before we have a discussion on how important it is to look at those network logs in Sentinel, right?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a very valid point. And the 90-day retention for free, so that would apply to sign-in logs in Azure or Entra as well, wouldn't it?
So the sign-in logs are unfortunately not for free. Okay. So Azure Activity is for free. That table will not be charged. Sign-in logs will be charged. But yes, those costs will be, well, depending on the size of your organization, they will be in line. And if you have an E5 license, for example, you can even ingest a certain amount of megabytes per user per day or per week, or there's some kind of discount on storage in Sentinel. And you can use that or partially for your sign-in logs. So that's also a very valid reason to look into Sentinel. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sign-in logs especially, right? They're there. But folks don't use them until they need them. And then the problem is when you need them, you can't get to them anymore because they've, you don't have the
only
retention,
30 days.
Right? And I've personally been in a situation where I've had a customer that was breached. Well, they weren't my customer to begin with, but I was helping them post breach. And you're in the situation where you're trying to discover what's going on, and and then you run out of log. Right. And it's really frustrating when you like, well, I can't really follow this any further because, we've gone beyond the 30-day retention and now we don't have the logs available to look at it. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so in Sentinel, your retention is free for 90 days. And after the 90 days, if you want to extend it further, you have to pay a little bit extra. But I think for sign-in logs, and especially when people are running E5 and they have the discount, the end price won't be that high. It will be definitely worth it. But again, if you look at Defender for Endpoint, for example, when you look at the threat and vulnerability management inside that product, and you get an idea of how many exploitable machines you have in your environment, or companies still excluding MFA for a big group of users, for example, I think those things are more important than looking at a lot of raw logs from all kinds of stuff.
And
because
you really need the resources to be able to look at that, right? And I know there are sort of managed service providers available, you guys being one of them, that can kind of help with that. But if you don't, like if your team is already stretched thin and they can't keep up with patching, they're never going to have the time to make sense of, gigabytes and gigabytes of log file data, because no one's going to just sit there looking through that stuff. There's always going to be something else that has to happen. So I think
that's true. So I work for an MSSP who provides these security monitoring services. And we go with every customer on a month-to-month basis through the reports and their secure score to help them point out the pain points, so to speak, so their secure score gets improved over time. But in the end, the patching and the decommissioning of old servers and legacy applications, that's still something they need to do on their own, of course. But on the other end, that's their job as a sysadmin, I would say. But indeed, the security stuff is certainly a specialty, especially the smaller companies. And since I live in the Netherlands, we have a lot of small companies here, especially compared to the US or Australia. So they don't have a fully fledged security department, people looking 24/7 at those events. And that's why they can give us a call, so that we can monitor that for them. But we only do the security monitoring, not the patching and the decommissioning stuff.
Yeah. Very good. Very interesting stuff. I think the Sentinel topic is such a large one, right, that I'm sure we'll cover some more things in other episodes where we can kind of dig into it.
And I will refrain from making this a Sentinel podcast. So Chris, you and I, when we started on this, we also really like the aspect that we are forced out of our comfort zone a little bit to dig into new topics. So I'll promise the listeners that I won't be covering Sentinel.
Before we go to this month's community project, I did want to ask you, do you want to recap Yellow Hat just really quickly? Because I know we talked about it on the last episode. It is coming up 6th of March, correct?
Yes.
Just one more shameless plug for you before we go on to.
Okay, appreciate it. Well, we actually sold out yesterday. So all the VIP tickets are sold out, but the live stream is obviously still available for registration. I'm not sure when this episode will be live, perhaps right before Yellow Hat. So then you really have to look at yellowhat.live, register for the live stream access. And we'll be live streaming from the afternoon to in the evening in Amsterdam time with some great guests. So thanks for the shout out. It will be a great day.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. To finish off, I guess this month's episode, the community project, I guess, that I wanted to talk about today is this is another Merrill Fernando project, and we love Merrill Fernando. I think everyone in sort of our community knows who Merrill is and follows the work he does. And this is just another great example. So the project is called bluesky.ms. I'm sure everyone is starting to see some traction on the Blue Sky social media platform. In many instances, I think the best way I could describe it is that it's what Twitter was 10 years ago. Before all of the stuff that happened in the meantime, and it's just a really good community of folks. And I think Merrill, one of the things that Merrill's been doing with this is to just help connect the Microsoft community, right? And it's one of the things I love. It's essentially just a crowdsourced database of all Microsoft community folks. So if you're on Blue Sky, or if you remember the heyday of Twitter and you're missing some good content, check out bluesky.ms. It basically just has anyone who's anyone in the Microsoft community. So just community users, Microsoft FTEs or full timers, blue badge guys or folks, MVPs, RDs. It doesn't matter. Anyone that's in the part of the Microsoft community, you can kind of find folks there, and they're sort of classified and categorized in ways. So if you wanted to, for example, follow Microsoft security MVPs, there's a way you can filter the list, and then you can instantly follow all of them through there. So it really makes that really easy. So I'm a big fan of this project, and I kind of wanted to shout it out. And I hope you guys will check it out and come join the community on Blue Sky.
Yeah, good stuff. So we have a busy schedule. Well, I at least have a very busy schedule in March. So like you said, Yellow Hat. I also will be speaking at Experts Live Denmark in Copenhagen. I actually have some days snowboarding in Austria between that and MVP Summit. So busy times, but we will see each other in the flesh in Seattle, right?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm very much looking forward to it. I go traveling. I got a lot of work travel coming up this actual weekend. So it's Friday today here. On Sunday I head out, and I'm pretty much doing laundry drops at home for the next month. I'll just be flying in, dropping off laundry, picking up some clean clothes, and heading out again. And then eventually, yeah, very, very busy month, but eventually making my way over to Redmond, and very much looking forward to catching up with everyone. Of course, Koos and I will be there. We're planning to record I guess it would be the April episode of Everyday Defender. We will hopefully record from somewhere from campus in Redmond. So looking forward to that one. It'll be an in-person recording, which is going to be great. But yeah, look, folks, really appreciate you listening to us and continuing to follow us on this journey. As always, open invitation. Reach out to us if there's anything that burning topics that you'd like sort of cracked open. We're super interested to dive into anything that you find interesting. With that, I think we'll sign off, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
See you soon, Chris.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.